this is really kind of a super difficult issue for all of us. So I think if you imagine any kind of conflict, large or small, somebody comes and talks to you about that conflict, and if you're anything like me, you nod your head as you listen, and just in simply doing that, you have been recruited onto that side. And all of a sudden somebody then goes, right, okay, well, Iain says, well, Iain didn't say anything. And this, in coming into apparent agreement, you have really fueled the conflict. And I think that is just so hard for all of us, because there's something about us when someone is aggrieved, we perceive victims to be innocent. That's the phrase, an innocent victim. But nobody in this world's an innocent victim. We're all perpetrators and we're all victims.
Welcome to this week's Calling a City to Life. We have the usual suspects here. No additional wheels or spokes or people or persons or guest preachers. It's just the gruesome foursome that is us. So let's go around the room and say good morning. We'll say good morning to Brodie first. Brodie might be sounding a bit husky. He's got a bit of a sore throat. Brodie, how are you this morning?
I'm feeling better than I was at the weekend, thank you.
Good stuff. You did delight us with the lovely phrase that it's better than I was, because it felt like I was chewing glass before, which is original. I haven't heard that one, but is very descriptive of a horrible sore throat. So glad you're feeling a bit better. Iain, how are you this morning?
I am absolutely fine, thank you very much. No infections to report on my behalf.
An infection-free zone. It's always positive. Always positive. Jac, how are you?
I am delighting in the recent weather, though it has been very cold. I am grateful for it not being windy or wet.
Cold is always better than windy or wet. Like absolutely freezing cold is always.
Well, you can always
preference.
put on layers, and you're not. It's not like getting wet when it's really rainy. Your jacket. There's sometimes it's so rainy that there's no jacket's going to help you.
We do have a ridiculous collection of jackets. We should open a thrift store for jackets or something.
Well, when you spend most of your day outside,
yes,
that's why.
And I'm always a fan of a jacket. It has to be said. You know this.
I do know that.
I can always be persuaded to buy a new jacket. Anyway, enough of that. Iain, you got Revelation 11 this week. Tell me, when you decided how you were going to split it between you and Brodie, did you count forward? On the basis you're going to take it kind of turn about, did you look forward and go, right, I've got to make sure I land on Revelation 11 because I don't want 12. So if I start, then it means I get 11. Or was it just, for want of a better expression, luck of the draw?
Neither of the above.
Okay, so, you tell me there was actual planning involved.
So there was planning involved, but I think, when you go deep into a series, and I guess when you get to this point, you're kind of into a territory that's slightly unpredictable. So actually, particularly with Revelation, because we've never really been this way before, it's not until you really get into it that you realise where some of the real kind of productive, life-changing stuff actually occurs. So yeah, I think, and sometimes that happens in surprising places. So I think when I got digging into Revelation 11 last week, I was surprised, delighted, and encouraged by what I came across. So no, this was not planned. In fact, I'm actually doing chapter 12 as well next week. So I haven't lifted that off my shoulders. And Brodie's got chapter 14, which actually I'd love to preach on. So there you go.
Okay, and tell me, because both of you have been at this for a while, do you have a note somewhere that says, "Oh, I've been this way before," or are you coming to some of these going, "I have never preached on Revelation 11 in my cream puff"?
Well, I've never preached all the way through Revelation before at all. I do have a note of sermons preached, and I did some years ago, did a little bit of a series, a bit of a dive into Revelation, but it wasn't as deep into the trumpets and bowls and seals as it has been this time around.
Richard, my uncle was a preacher, and he said sermons are like baked beans. If you reheat them, they burn and stick to the pot.
So after you preach a sermon, bro, you tear it up to never be preached again.
Right. I'm rubbish at record keeping, so I don't have a very good record of where I've been on things like that. So yeah, come to it fresh.
Yeah.
Well, there you go. The joys of podcasting mean that this is now being recorded forever.
So I do have records of everything, Richard, and I know that I haven't been this way before, but I do find sometimes that actually being able to dig into what you did before kind of helps inspire or get an angle on something. So I do think it's quite useful. So I encourage Brodie in his record keeping, because he might find some of that to be useful. Though having said that, even if you, I think a lot of preachers would say this, that even if you actually preach the same sermon, it's not the same sermon. That in the preaching, God does something by his Spirit for the people who are there at that moment, at that time. So you can never preach the same sermon twice.
Cool. Well, we're going to ask you to kind of preach the same sermon twice by asking you to do 60-second summary of it now. So tell us about Revelation 11.
Oh, wow. Yeah, the world is a place of conflict and tension. That's the reality that we live in. How do we respond to that as followers of Jesus? Well, we're called to be a people who represent him by being the temple, that is the place of his presence, and we're called to represent him in the world by being a prophetic witness, that is, if you like, a distinctive evangelistic challenge in the world that needs to be humble, and it needs to be informed and inspired by the Spirit as God promises, and that's our place. But also, maybe just to kind of wrap that up by saying this is part of the part of the trumpets that blow. We're kind of in an interlude between the 6th and 7th trumpet, so there's a good end coming, and even though we are in difficult times, the 7th trumpet will blow, and that will be God's glory.
Now, you started by kind of alluding to, like, I don't think you would have given the same start to your sermon had it not all been kicking off, for want of a better expression, in the Middle East right now, and for the want of there being several well-known and some lesser well-known Christian preachers who are, just taking Revelation, taking what's happening in the Middle East and going for a long walk off a short pier. Now, eventually, if you predict enough things often enough, you will be right. It's like a clock stop one day. So one time someone will say this is the sign of the end, and they'll actually be right. But it probably won't be because of divine revelation or anything. It'll just be good timing. Can you just push into a little as to why you thought it was important to kind of slightly contextualise what you were talking about versus what's going on in the world right now?
I think we can use the Bible, and the Bible has been used, weaponized really, to fuel particular perspectives about the Middle East. And I mean, when you've got, so many books full of so many obscure signs, you can slap a sign on anything. And I think obviously Israel and people's reflections on Israel feed into that. And I think a lot of us have come through a culture which perceives what is going on in the Middle East as somehow being a manifestation of prophecy, and particularly prophecy from Revelation. And I guess that also kind of hangs about in the background with people not really looking into it. And we then end up kind of getting caught in a particular side of the conflict. And I think we need to recognise that that's not what Revelation is talking about, and that actually even a lot of the prophetic words that people have seemed to just extract out of Revelation haven't actually come to pass. And then people have then gone into it, well, if it wasn't that, it must be this. And just we get into a whole problematic position, which then feeds into a political posturing, which actually works against what God is saying, because this book is not about a kind of predictive assessment of what's going on in world politics. It's actually about how God's people can stand amidst these things and not endorse what's going on, but actually be witnesses in the midst of it all.
Yeah, I actually reread Hal Lindsey, late great Planet Earth, but it was really interesting to see just how badly that kind of style of reading Revelation has kind of not gone well in terms of how it was written and what was in. Interesting, although there were some really good points in it, just about church and evangelism and all the rest of it. And so I wonder, is there any extent to which we throw the baby out with the bathwater? Is there any extent to which looking at Revelation on a real macro level, as we're doing, that it's, the witnesses are about the church or the New Testament, whatever, that we miss out on, actually there might be individuals involved in this? Do we just end up in our own wee silos because it's difficult to be nuanced in the current setting?
I think the current setting needs nuance above all other things, because I think we're in a position where the world has become very, very polarised. I mean, this is kind of something that I kind of went on to talk about later on, that where there is conflict and where we perceive someone to be offended, and particularly in the Middle East, we're looking at people who on all sides have been hurt and offended. And if I can just put it out there, I think the Christians who represent the Lord and are God's people are the ones that actually get often overlooked in all of this. But we tend to, we talk about innocent victims, and we kind of almost sanctify victims because they've been victimized. But actually, I think one of the challenges in all of this is not just simply to jump onto whatever victim's side we feel at a certain point in time. And I think often politically that's what's happening. And certainly when you think about the Middle East, everybody has an offence and an injury that needs to be rectified, and just simply identifying with one side, whether that's validated in some kind of theological way or not, doesn't actually represent the Lord's purposes and plans in this place. I think it just simply fuels the fire. I don't know if that kind of makes any sense, but I was trying to kind of I was really just challenged personally about my emotional state when each of the news reports came in. And I mean, of course, you feel absolutely horrified at the terror that the people in the south of Israel near Gaza experience. And then, you see the next thing that happens and the equivalent, horror that Palestinian people experience with the bombardment. And, and you kind of oscillate between one side and another. And I felt, just in reflecting through all of this, and just personally, that actually we need to learn as Christian believers not to come into agreement with people just because they're injured. And I think that starts at a very personal level as well as at a macro level. So I'm not sure if that's answering your question or avoiding it, Richard, but that's kind of part of what I want to say.
Even if it's not an answer to my question, it's a good answer.
Yeah, it's a really powerful point. It's a really powerful point. You started obviously by talking about the measuring rod. I mean, I have to say, I do think in all the years of hearing you preach, your funniest line ever was, and all God's people said, "We're glad we're not preaching today," which I do think was very funny. But you obviously talk about the fact that John's given this religious task. And if you look at it on the surface level, it's kind of, everyone's confused. There is no temple anymore. He's to go and measure the temple. And then you talk about the fact that, of course, God is manifest in his people, and his temple is where his people are. And so the measuring is of the people. Like, where are we? Where is his church? Firstly, can I just double check that I'm correct in my understanding of that? as the point you were making.
Well, that's the point I was making. Whether we've all got it right
Okay,
or not
that's
is
good.
maybe another issue. But yeah, I mean, maybe just even frame that as well, Jackie. Just that we're at the point of the sixth trumpet. So if you think about these cycles of trumpets and seals and bowls, they kind of cycle up to a position of real intensity. So like trumpet 6, seal 6, that's kind of where the world is at its worst, and this kind of cycle of reaping what humanity sows is kind of going on at its most intense. So we come into this beginning of chapter 11 looking at this measuring rod, and in our ears is still the noise of these conflicts and battles and disruptions and all sorts, and we haven't yet got to, God's resolved everything. So this is a kind of really in between time. So it's, in my view, it's really saying, what do we do as God's people as we come towards the end of time, as all of these things are going on, and this whole chapter is really steeped in Zechariah, so people need to kind of go and read all of Zechariah, and this is it's kind of a re-immersion in the vision of Zechariah 2, which is about the restoration of the temple in Jerusalem, but there is no temple in Jerusalem because it's now disappeared. So my kind of question then is, well, what is the temple that he's measuring? The temple that he's measuring appears to be what Paul and Peter say is God's people, who we are the temple in which God lives by his Spirit. So it's an assessment of where are God's people at this point in time, and to what extent are we embodying and manifesting the presence of Jesus by the power of the Spirit in the world. So that's my take on it.
I mean, the word that came to me today was tapestry about Revelation, like this sense that all of it, how it's all weaving in together and referencing back one chapter to another. Because the sense that I got was, if we're asking where are we as a church, then surely we are called upon to look back to the letters to the churches at the beginning of Revelation and to be reflecting on where our weaknesses and where our strengths are within that. But I wonder, Brodie, if you could speak some to the importance of us individually and corporately in a church setting of being able to reflect on and to take stock of where we are in order to move forward and to be living as God is calling us to in Revelation as the church.
I was thinking about this as I listened to, you should try this, I listened to the podcast at 1.25 speed in my walk-in so that I managed to get it all in. I did listen live on Sunday from my bed of sickness, as Richard put it as well. And we all talk fast, so when we put it on at 1.25 speed, it's even faster. Where we go in chapter 11 is these two witnesses, and Iain kind of said, this is representative of the church. But it's not just the church has a prophetic witness, the church is a prophetic witness. So in our very being as church, and as we are knitted together by the Spirit, we witness to something. We witness to God's presence, His activity on earth. We witness to what true worship is. So going back to your point of this is, in some respects, all an expansion of those 7 oracles to the churches. It's a revealing of that. And then in the two witnesses, as Iain said, people can say, the representative of Elijah and Moses. And one of the main things that Elijah and Moses were witnessing against was oppression and idolatry. So we come back to this theme of idolatry. So one of the big questions that I've been wrestling with, again, I don't have particularly good answers to, but I think it's important to ask the question is, what are the idols that we have? What is distracting us from true worship that is tainting our prophetic witness of it's God that we and that that we worship. And so I think that's a real challenge in an age where idols are more hidden. And one of the big things that's happening in all of these things, so back to what it means to be prophetic in Revelation, which goes back, I think, to Richard's initial question of this is an unveiling rather than a foretelling. So it's not predicting in that sense. So it's unveiling what these idols are, where these powers are. And we need that unveiling now. We need that discernment out of there are powers at work that are anti-God, that are anti his witnesses, that cause this violence and destruction. And we need to be aware of what those powers are, and make sure that we're coming under the lordship of Jesus.
Wow, that's a good answer. Iain, after that, you then go on to talk about the fact that God is made visible through his people, and we need to therefore be present in difficult and dark places. And I suppose in some ways you're possibly referencing, again, wars in the world and so on, but the importance we find on the importance we place on finding a side in situations in order to allow us to know who the victim is. And I find that really striking. I was thinking about church life generally and conflict resolution within churches even, and the desire we have to feel who is wrong and who is right in any given situation. But you were actually saying, are we showing up to fuel conflict or to resolve it? And just as a behaviour pattern, I just feel like that is a really powerful thing in churches, because conflict can be very difficult in a church context. And in order to be God's people truly, if we feel like conflict is something that's very, evident in our church life, which all churches are, show me the one that it isn't. And, I'm assuming that's in heaven. But what does it look like to see conflict in those situations and to be the peacemaker truly?
Yeah, I think this is just, this is really kind of a super difficult issue for all of us. So I think if you imagine any kind of conflict, large or small, somebody comes and talks to you about that conflict, and if you're anything like me, you nod your head as you listen. Mm-hmm. And just in simply doing that, you have been recruited onto that side. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden somebody then goes, right, okay, well, Iain says, well, Iain didn't say anything. And all of a sudden, there's this power base, people are saying, and this, in coming into apparent agreement, you have really fueled the conflict. And I think that is just so hard for all of us, because there's something about us when someone is aggrieved, and as I said before, just when we perceive victims to be innocent. That's the phrase, an innocent victim. But nobody in this world's an innocent victim. We're all perpetrators and we're all victims. And none of us see the world through a perfect lens. So when you come alongside somebody to help, and they're enlisting, the help that they really want is to enlist you to be on their side, all of a sudden you've fueled the conflict. And so I think it's just a real challenge to think about how we engage in a situation where there is dispute without actually fueling either side. I can think of real situations where I have tried to be super fair, and then you actually realise, people don't want you to be fair, or people don't perceive you to be fair, or you come in and then you become the scapegoat for both sides. So I really don't think this is an easy path, and maybe this is where we need to enlist some people who are really skilled. But this came from me. I was listening to a podcast about Israel and Gaza, and somebody on this podcast said, neither the Palestinians nor the Israelis have the capability to resolve this issue, because each side in this conflict are so stuck in their own trauma that neither has the capacity to build peace. And what actually you need is an independent third party to coordinate and to hold those differences. And it really struck me that, as believers, what the real kind of essential importance of having a third party that isn't on either side, to actually resolve conflict, and someone that both sides can trust. And I just think, some of that it's a real skill, but it's also something I think we should all be kind of looking for. I'm not saying there aren't times when you need to take sides, but I just think it's so easy for us to be enlisted onto one side, and it's more of a warning than anything else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Brodie, can I just ask, you were talking about idolatry a minute ago, and I was wondering, do we have idolatry towards our grievances? And by that I mean, sometimes do we become so comfortable in our stuck place, or in our pained place, or in the place where we feel like our identity is wrapped up in the pain that we have, that it becomes an idol and we're actually not really able to move away from it? That's maybe too complicated a question. But
no, I think there's probably something in that, Jackie. I think idolatry often morphs into ideology.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And so ideology is to hold a belief for which there's no actual evidence, but you're going to hold it anyway. It's a hill that you're going to die on. And very often we turn our grievances into an ideology. So there's no moving or shaking that person. And I think a real challenge for us isn't there of Paul in 2 Corinthians says, having been reconciled to God, you now have this ministry of reconciliation. Now, for sure, part of that ministry of reconciliation is saying to other people, hey, come on, you can be reconciled to God as well, but it's also being reconciled to each other. And how do we operate in that ministry? I think that's a ministry of the church global, and that we need to learn to grow in. Because, as you say, very often we fall out with each other, never mind with other people. How do we do that? And that's a challenge. I think the other thing I was struck when Iain was preaching on this by something, a quote I heard from Shane Claiborne: all Christians don't have a compassion problem, they have a proximity problem. Of very often, we're compassionate towards those who are hurting, those who are poor, those who are oppressed, but we have no relationship. And that's a challenge. I personally find that a challenge. I work with Christians. It's not that we don't need ministry, etc. But when it comes to being in hurting places, very often I'm with really nice people. QP, you're really nice people who, on the whole, have got themselves reasonably well together, and we know where the answers are, etc. Of my problem is that proximity problem. And there was a study done in 2015, and then it was repeated again in like 2021 or something. And what this study showed was that as Christians in general, we have fewer non-Christian friends than what we had 10, 15 years ago. Their proximity problem perhaps is getting worse. So part of the challenge is how do we become salt out the salt cellar, out the salt grinder, whatever. How do we get in, not with an agenda, but just in relationship with people who are hurting, who don't know God, who haven't got the comfort and the empowerment of the Spirit to deal with the difficult situations they're in. And I'm, as I say personally, given where my workplace is, I find that a real challenge.
Just to briefly go back to what Iain was saying, I don't know to what extent anyone's familiar with what's called the drama triangle. If you're not familiar with it, there's lots of nodding going on in the Zoom call for everybody who's listening in. Go and Google the drama triangle. It's a thing a guy, Stephen Cartman, came up with, and it's just really interesting. There's three corners to a triangle, and the corners are persecutor, rescuer, and victim. And kind of the whole conceit of it is that it's not about putting yourself into one of those corners. It's about not trying to identify as any of those things, because it just puts everybody into a box. And as Iain has touched on, it leads to a complete lack of nuance and a complete lack of the ability to say to a rescuer, well, maybe rescuing is not quite what you need to do here just now, or to a persecutor, well, maybe you're not persecuting as much as you think you are, and to a victim, well, maybe you're not entirely innocent. I don't know if that's a decent summary, gentlemen who are familiar with it, but go and Google the drama triangle. It's a really useful ready reckoner for a lot of what's been spoken about.
I wanted to talk about Zechariah because obviously there is a lot of connection between the two books, and I wanted a little bit of wisdom from Brodie and Iain about how we get the best out of both passages when we see the way that they're connecting and relating. What's the wisdom, especially when one says something slightly differently from the other? What's the wisdom in connecting them both and getting all the value out of them? Brodie is now laughing.
So I think Brodie has to answer this one.
That is just such an easy question to answer, because it's not just Zechariah. He's obviously drawing on Ezekiel 40 to 42 as well, with the measuring that happens there. Listen, there's volumes and volumes of books written on how the New Testament writers interpret and reinterpret the Old Testament.
Most of which during this podcast I seem to have ended up buying, thanks to you guys.
I can add to your book list, Richard. Where to go with this? I need a moment to think, Jackie.
Iain.
Well, you've got an interlude.
Yes, I'll be that interlude. I mean, I think it's really important to understand context and who is being directly addressed. So the book of Zechariah comes as a word to returning exiles, to people who will restore the temple. So you've got to start off from what was this book intended to do, who's it speaking to. So once you kind of get that understanding. So this is particularly focused on a guy called Zerubbabel, who is one of the olive trees, along with the prophet, or the priest rather. And so it's addressed to people who are returning to rebuild the temple. And I think that gives you a bit of a context of what's actually happening. And I think that's where I would suggest everybody starts. Let's give the Bible the opportunity to speak for itself. Who is it actually talking to? What is the kind of timeline? Where does it sit in terms of the history of God's people? And then you kind of, the New Testament often is a riff on the Old Testament. It's taking something and reinterpreting it around the death and resurrection of Jesus. So in this instance, what in Revelation you've always got to say, well, what are you seeing? What is John seeing? It's about what's being revealed. And so he is reliving this vision. So he's stepping back, he's actually more immersed in it, I think, than Zechariah is, because he's actually holding the stick. So he is reliving it, but he is reliving in a different context. And so, my question really, for example, in this one was, this is a vision of the temple and measuring the temple, but there's no temple. So what we're being told here? We're being told that restoration of God's presence, God's manifest presence in the temple, is a reality at this point in time, but it looks different. So we're taking the same picture, but it's being reinterpreted for a different context. And I think oftentimes that's what's happening. I think one of the things just to always be aware of is that the kind of language and imagery of the New Testament generally tends to be Old Testament, because that's what everybody understands and knows. So to draw from the same source, and maybe just in the way we might draw examples from Netflix or TV channel, the resource book for a lot of what the New Testament people are saying is the Old Testament, and also they're kind of reinterpreting this big narrative of salvation as well. It's not just they're randomly picking examples. They're saying this is that, this is how this now applies, this is how it looks in this context post crucifixion and resurrection. Brodie, just giving you a bit of time to get the right answer. So, what's your answer?
Wow, I don't know that I've got a right answer of. So the word that I wrote down when I was thinking there was jazz. So John is playing jazz with the Old Testament. It's the same notes, or it's some of the same notes, but the arrangement of them has that familiar. I can hear the tune. So I can hear the tune of Ezekiel, I can hear the tune of Daniel, I can hear the tune of Zechariah, but it now sounds different because he's playing jazz, and don't want to use the word up-level it, and therefore it carries a different weight, but it's connected to that same story. Things have changed. John now has greater revelation than New Testament's because they've encountered the living Christ. No stuff that the Old Testament writers perhaps foresaw, and therefore that's a game changer in how things are understood as well. So the New Testament is jazz on the Old Testament would be my summary.
As you say that, I am immediately drawn to Morecambe and Wise and the same notes, not necessarily in the right order, as being a good
I don't
way
think
of
we're
looking
saying
at
they're the wrong
Revelation.
order.
No, but that's the thing about Revelations. It's not, as we started off this whole series, it's not a continuum of this follows that, follows the next thing. So no, that's really good, Brodie. I like that a lot. 12 musicians all playing different tunes. We went from measuring rods, and who doesn't I did say to Jack when this was started, who doesn't, what I don't wish to be pejorative, but what man doesn't like the answer being go and get yourself a really brand new tool because that'll do the thing? Like, go get a really nice measuring rod. Visit to B&Q. I do like that idea.
And like lots of people who buy new tools, he doesn't use it.
Doesn't use it, right? It just sits in the corner.
At least not in this chapter.
I've got a story because I am that person who bought a tool, never used it, and then in this past week we found the perfect use for it, but I'll save it for my cultural reference towards the end. So stay tuned. Prophetic witness we move on to, and then the seventh trumpet. As time is not our friend, let's kind of roll this in together. Where do we end up at the end of chapter 11? Like, what's left to come? We've got the seventh trumpet. We think of that as being, the end, but it's clearly not.
Well, the end of the world as we know it, as God promises it, is the beginning of God's glorious kingdom, and I think that's kind of wrapped up in verse 15, isn't it? That the kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, and he will reign forever and ever. So there is this wrapping in, this sanctifying, purifying, detoxing of the world and bringing it in and under the reign of Christ, and things are put right in that process. So all of that longing that we have had for justice and for equanimity is now fulfilled in this text, which offers the reign of God. The nations that were angry have been put to rights. The judgment of evil is done, and God's people are affirmed and blessed. So yeah, it is the putting right of all things.
But obviously you talked about from the time of Jesus' resurrection to when Jesus comes again, we have the Holy Spirit, and he is not in short supply, and we have all that we need for this period in time.
For life and godliness.
And the verses, well, indeed. And the verses in Revelation 11 between 4 and 6, when it talks about the two witnesses, and if anyone harms them, fire flashes from their mouth, and so on. I found that really challenging because I think sometimes we live in Holy Spirit poverty, and we don't feel that we are able to access for whatever reason, or we feel that we're not seeing what we are believing for in terms of how we are allowing ourselves to be filled by the Holy Spirit in any given circumstance of our lives. Could you just speak a bit into that? Because I certainly am not aware that I would feel that if anyone harmed me, that fire was flashing from my mouth. I'm not saying that it's meant to be literal in that way, but the power of it.
So what we're reading an apocalypse which is revealing things. And if we think back to, Paul saying that our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. So I would read this, as you said, of not literally of fires coming from my mouth and consuming somebody who's insulted me, but that as we speak forth God's truth, as we worship in spirit and truth, as we witness to the resurrected Christ, that what we are doing has a spiritual effect. And what an encouragement that is to us, what an encouragement that is to these churches. So, when we go back to, the earlier chapters and think of, what was happening on the ground in these churches. And here's John saying, well, as you remain faithful, here is what is actually happening, even though you don't see it, even though you don't see the fruit of it yet. And this is what is happening. So think of it, we do see this happen of, I can remember when we were doing party and we would meet on a Tuesday night for prayer and worship and things like that. And people would say, well, I feel that the atmosphere has changed. I feel that something has shifted. And that's what we see happening here. And we see that other times in other places as well. Would we like to see more? Absolutely. Are there blockages to that? Yes. Do we know what all those are? No. But this is an encouragement to press in to that. So we're back to Shirley's words to us last week of lean in, press in, remain faithful, because something is happening even though we don't see it in a spiritual realm.
So these verses are really significant then as encouragement to us about what is happening in the spiritual realm.
I think when you look at this text as a whole, it's not suggesting that we as Christians are going to be thriving, always blessed in the place of power and authority. It's written to churches that are facing persecution. They're flickering lamps. There's 5 of the churches have just about been snuffed out, and there's 2 that are being faithful. And then we even kind of read, and I'm not entirely sure what the interpretation of the death of the prophets are and their resurrection, but I certainly take from that even if it appears that the witness of the church has been snuffed out, that like Ezekiel's dry bones, there is the Spirit is alive to blow life into them. And I think that's just such an encouragement, because it's not just our own mistakes or unfaithfulness that can snuff the church out. It can be, massive persecution. The church in North Africa in the early days was massively powerful and influential, but it's not anymore. The church in Turkey was that was the heartbeat of the church, but the core of the church has shifted and moved. So I think there is an encouragement here that the witness of God will not be snuffed out, even when it is brutally attacked and where physical churches are and communities of people are extinguished. And I think that's just even to get back to the context that we've been thinking about in the Middle East. That Christians, one of the consequences of all that's going on is that Christians are feeling very much the minority and feeling the threat, because in a sense, even denominations cross the Palestinian-Israeli border. The church in Gaza, the hospital in Gaza that was supported by the Anglicans and Baptists is managed from Jerusalem. So there are all of these flickering lamps currently, and I think one of the ways that we can be engaged is to be praying and standing with our brothers and sisters in the Middle East. I heard someone recently say, we're the mother church. You guys became Christians because of us. This is it's the call that Paul had to resource the church in Jerusalem because it was undergoing persecution with finance and with the offering, the collection that he talks about in Corinthians. That same call is going out to God's people today. The church in the Middle East is really under very, very difficult circumstances spiritually and materially. And they're asking us to pray. So I think one of the ways in which we can support our mother church, as it were, because these Christians have been in those places since Jesus. These families can probably trace themselves all the way back. They're the mother church, and I think one of the ways that we can be engaged in what's been described here is to be praying for those people in these days, and praying that they would be full of the Holy Spirit, and praying that they would be witnesses in a difficult situation and peacemakers in these kind of times.
Yeah, I think it's really important always, as you've both suggested, to set Revelation and remember it's a letter to some churches that are struggling. I'm almost tempted to say at the bottom of each page, beyond the letters to churches, you should write, remember, this is a letter to some churches. It's not a movie script or something just to debate and enjoy because of the unknowability of it. It's actually a practical letter to some churches that were struggling, just as you suggest. Churches in similar areas, not quite the same area, are struggling today.
And it's primarily a letter of encouragement, Richard, as well. And I think that's, when we try and use it as a decoding tool rather than this as a letter of encouragement. Having said that, the numbers mean something. So in chapter 11, we have 1,260 days. Back in those days, there was 30 days in each month. They weren't kind of like 31 like we have. So that's the same as the 42 months, which is 3.5 years. So we have this 3.5, and even kind of like I'm as puzzled as Iain over, the two witnesses dying and then being resurrected. That all I can kind of like, that just takes me to, and the gates of hell will not prevail. But so you've a 3.5 there, and that speaks of a time being cut short. And one commentator that I read said, why does he not just kind of like say 42 months in chapter 11 as well? And 42 months doesn't sound like a very long time, but 1,260 days does. So there's a perspective thing there. For us here on earth, 1,260 days seems like forever. How long? So we're back to, the saints under the altar. How long, God, are you going to let this go on? But time, the encouragement is, time has been cut short, and that God is in this and moving, that it doesn't go on forever and ever. This isn't an intractable, goes on forever struggle.
Just like this podcast.
And probably the really simple point that is that 42 and 1,260 are the same number if you have 30 days in the month. And that means that the time of persecution and trial is exactly the same time as the Holy Spirit is poured out. So that's the encouragement, that there is sufficient of God for every day of the time of trial. And that kind of speaks to this kind of fear of the scarcity of the Spirit that we live in, and this kind of miserly version of God's gracious provision. And we kind of think, there's a little bit of Spirit here and a little bit there, but actually God has poured out enough of himself for every day of persecution and for every situation of persecution. And I think that's one of my takeaways from this, that the numbers indicate. And every time you see this, because times, was it 2 times and half a time, the 3.5 is a couple of these kind of repetitious symbols. And you realise that actually, if this is all actually the same time, then the same provision is being made for all of these times.
Well, before we go on for 1,260 days discussing it, we're going to bring the podcast to a close. We're going to cut it short. Not really, because we're going to be at least an hour probably. But let's quickly go round the doors. A little bit of a cultural reference, a little bit of a summary. Iain, you'll be going last. So first up, let's have Jackie.
So I've been troubled ever since last week about your cultural reference spot.
Or about the one I gave, or about you coming up with one?
No, just because I feel entirely without culture.
Oh, right,
and
okay.
we came away from last week and Iain's been at a concert or is going to a concert, and Shirley's going to tap dancing classes, and I've got the latest HTB song that I've been listening to, and I've reflected genuinely all week thinking, where's the culture in my life? I am devoid of any, and also feeling slightly embarrassed because I genuinely listen to almost exclusively worship music, with the exception of dancing in the kitchen last night with my niece because she was here for dinner. And I was kind of like, I am without culture. So I'm kind of making peace with it because I've decided music is all music, and I don't want to have kind of split lines between secular and non-secular or whatever. And I'm going to tell you that Brooke Ligertwood's latest album, 8, is out. And it is called, it is called 8, but the first track on the album is called Bless God. And it is written by herself, Brandon Lake, and Cody Carnes. Cody Carnes had it on his album a few months back. It is an absolutely wonderful song. I hope that we're singing it soon in QP. And I'm sorry that's about as cultural as I am going to get.
So if you would like to contact the show to suggest cultural things that Jack could get involved with doing,
I don't have the
then
time.
email office@qpbc.org for, like, it'd be like a busman's holiday. It's like challenge. Remember Challenge Annika? We can have Challenge Jackie. Jackie's got to go and I like this idea. I like this idea a lot. I think, Brodie, you should have to come up with a cultural reference, a suggestion for Jackie as well, and then we'll do closing. Brodie.
So a tune to dance to, Jackie, I've been listening to the Scott Wood band. Scott Wood and his wife Mary are two of the members of Celtic Worship. Scott and Mary are incredibly talented musicians, but one of his tracks I really like is Looking Through Portnahaven. So Portnahaven is on what island, Iain?
Actually, real cultural reference here. That's where I'm from, that's where the Macaulays are actually from. My grandfather ran the post office in Portnahaven.
So it's a lovely tune that starts off...
It's an Isla.
It's an Isla. So it's a lovely tune that starts off really slow and ends up in a polka. But so second cultural reference is we're in the trumpets. So if you like the tune Gabriel's Oboe from the film The Mission, then listen to Ryan Anthony's version of it. You'll find it on YouTube. Ryan Anthony plays it on a piccolo trumpet, and I think it is the best version there is of Gabriel's Oboe. It is just makes the hair in the back of your neck stand up.
And that's something, Brodie, for you and me, who are somewhat both follically challenged.
I've got plenty here. I get plenty here, just not the top of the
here
head.
The backs of our necks. Just the tops of our heads that are problematic. Iain?
Oh gosh, yeah, not so much culture in my life this week, so I'm with Jackie on all of this.
Challenge Iain and Jackie could be a 10-part series for sure. Coming to Netflix. Great stuff. Very quickly, my cultural reference, which flies back to what we said earlier. I got to use a metal detector this week, and it actually worked. Actually found something we were looking for that Jack had dropped. Something of value.
I had. My necklace had broken.
I mean, you hadn't dropped it deliberately. It had broken.
No. Yeah,
and
my
fallen
necklace
out in the middle of a field, and we managed to actually find this little trinket with a metal detector. So I'm officially a metal detectorist.
Yeah. I'm very proud of you.
Excellent. And next week, tune in for my butter story following on from the crisp sandwich last week. But let's do final thoughts, Brodie.
Final thoughts. Be encouraged, remain faithful. Can't end with better words. The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our God and of his Messiah. And we should do like the 24 elders and fall down in worship.
I just keep feeling more and more excited by Revelation, words I thought I would never utter.
Iain, you preach it, you get the final word.
Yeah, let me finish with the thing that I suppose I'm kind of continuing to be troubled with or disturbed by, and it's just the whole issue of coming into agreement and alignment and thinking, how can I make sure that I am the peacemaker rather than the one that fuels the offence and the fire, and yet also bring in some way God's healing presence to conflict. So I guess there'll be some people out there like me who are thinking, well, how do I ensure that I don't get enlisted into somebody else's offence and come into agreement? Or how can I step out of something that I have apparently willingly, unwillingly, wittingly or unwittingly endorsed? So that's a slightly different response to the other guys.
Great stuff. I thank you all very much for listening. Don't forget we have a transforming event this Friday at QPBC. If you're listening to this in time, then before the 27th, then there are still tickets available. Check the website for details. Thank you all very much for tuning in. Leave us a review and some stars, and pass on the links to all your friends to listen in. Maybe don't get them to start at Revelation 11. Maybe refer them to the first ones first. Or I suppose jumble them up. It would be appropriate. But there we go. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.